So, all right, now you're good. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. And so this is where the support from all of you really means so much. Over the 30 years that the Food from the Bar has been occurring, over I believe it's actually $1.5 million has been raised, which is 2.8 million meals out to the community. So thank you so much for your continued partnership, and more to come on this later in the presentation. So turning to the legislative response that we have at the food bank. So looking at the policy and advocacy work we're engaging in. So by distributing food, connecting with our partners to get food out, that is meeting the immediate need of individuals who are hungry today and tomorrow. But how are we addressing food insecurity on that longer term scale? And one way that we're doing that is through our advocacy engagement. So what our team does at the food bank is broken into essentially 3 categories. So we focus on strengthening strategic policy partnerships. So helping our elected officials best understand what food insecurity is looking like, having them hear from their constituents with that lived experience, what that experience has been like for them as a resident of Contra Costa County or whatever city or district they represent. We meet with our elected officials all the way from city mayors, county supervisors, state assembly and senate, and our federal electeds at least once a quarter. And we really have built strong policy partnerships where we're seeing many of our own electeds be the ones to champion food security related legislation, especially here in California. The second thing we do is our legislative steering for the organization. So hearing the needs of the community members, hearing the needs of the food bank and where we try to go as an organization, we form our legislative agenda, which directs our year-long advocacy engagement. And the process of building that legislative agenda is done in a unique way. We really place a high priority on the lived experience and that more qualitative human aspect from our community members who have experienced food insecurity, poverty, and we convene 2 community-based programs, the speaker series and our community advocacy partnership. And in both of these groups, we bring together these community members with lived experience. In the speaker series, we train them how to be advocates. And in the community advocacy partnership, they work with us all year long, engaging in advocacy. This gives them the opportunity to join elected official meetings with us, conferences, and really refine their ability to inform public policy and its direction with their lived experience. So within all of this, we have a very small but mighty advocacy team, and we want to be really mindful of our resources. So our policy scope is very focused on anti-hunger specifically. This means we're typically engaging with about 15 to 40 bills annually, but we do leave a portion of that legislative agenda open to being dynamic enough to respond to whatever's going on and might be related or perpetuating hunger in our community. So earlier in the pandemic, we were seeing that our schools had really low enrollment for the school meals programs when schools first closed down. So that was the first time we really started advocating alongside our schools, but that's what was needed because that was a hunger need we had identified. We also want to be very reflective of the community that we serve. So understanding what are the demographics and populations that the food bank is serving, and how can our policy and our advocacy be reflective of that? I won't go into this entire statement, but this is the mission statement our advocacy team has put together. And what I will call out is that our specific focus is to identify the root causes specific to our region for hunger. So when we look at hunger responses, they're typically not the most effective if there's a one-size-fits-all approach for the whole nation. But why is it happening here in Contra Costa County? And how can we best engage and collaborate with our community advocates and our elected officials and really be the connector between all of these players to best articulate what a stronger social safety net program would look like? I'm sure this is not news to anyone, but I always find the definition of food insecurity really interesting because it is a spectrum in some sense. So Feeding America defines food insecurity as the state of being without reliable access to a sufficient quantity of affordable, nutritious food. And reliable, sufficient, affordable, and nutritious are all really key parts in this. You might have enough food, but it might not be nutritious. You might be able to have food close to you, but can you afford it? So all four of these elements are something that we're looking at in our approach. And as of this month, Contra Costa County's food insecurity rate is at 17% for the entire county, which is much higher than it was prior to COVID-19. So events like this come at such a wonderful time because the need is here and it is directly here in our community. I'm happy to share this PowerPoint with you all, but this has been a really great framework and visual for me in understanding how cyclical food insecurity is and how it can contribute to diet-related illnesses, eating patterns that aren't healthy. And we could talk for a long time on this, but I mention it to bring up just how many parts of our lives our food has, and food insecurity, how much of an impact it really does have. So we want to ensure we're interacting with our clients from a place of dignity and really being there for them wherever they're at in life. Going back to our advocacy, we are so grateful for the collaboration of our board, our advocates, our staff, our community. That's really helped us see some great outcomes in these very challenging times. We've received some national recognition and have been able to lead a conference session in the last year about how effective advocacy can be done in centering the lived experience of advocates. And we are very excited that the current administration has scheduled the first ever White House conference on hunger, health, and nutrition for this upcoming September. One thing that is going really well here in California, where we're a leader nationwide, is that we've established the School Meals for All program. That happened in the 2021 legislative cycle, so last year. And this is something that now other states are looking to California to adopt similar legislation. But one way California is being a champion in this space, and we are really proud that one of our own elected officials, Senator Nancy Skinner, was the author of that legislation. And this is something that just happened in June. We had the opportunity to travel to Washington, D.C. to continue to share what's going on here on the ground in district to our elected officials. Food insecurity hasn't gone away, and in fact, it's gotten worse. And so we had the opportunity to work alongside our national partners at Feeding America, meet with some of our elected officials, and gain their insights on what we can look forward to for federal legislation in the new calendar year. So that is all I have. I'm happy to take questions. And I know Tavy's also on the call if there's any more specific food bank questions you have for either of us.
All right. I think I'm next, so I will go ahead and start speaking.
Let me just introduce you to those that may not know. And also, I did want to add one thing to Cassidy's presentation. I just got an email blast this morning from the food bank informing us that in the last 3 months, the food bank has seen a 50% rise in the need to provide food to the elderly. And I was just really surprised at that. No one should be hungry in Contra Costa County, especially the elderly. But anyway, so Carol, most of you probably do know Carol. She's our recognized ethics expert in the bar. She teaches at USF Law School and has published extensively on professional responsibility and legal ethics. And thank you so much for joining us today to help out.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. I think this is a very, very important cause and have donated myself to it. So, you know, where do we find the rules that talk about you know, donating your services, and how does the bar address it in rules of professional conduct? Well, it's kind of hard because the rules of professional conduct go to lawyers and their practice, right, of law. So what you find are some rules that talk about donating pro bono services in terms of legal services. But you also see this language that talks about the lawyer as a public citizen. And I think it's because they want to go as far as they can go. I've drafted rules before, so I know how this works. They go as far as they can go in other ways they can go, because remember, these rules have to be passed by many states and get through their bar board of trustees and that kind of thing. So you see, first in the ABA rules, surprisingly, I think the ABA rules are better than the California rules in addressing pro bono and the concepts of the lawyer as citizen. You see in the, the very first preamble in comment 6, they're saying a lawyer should be mindful of deficiencies in the administration of justice, and the fact that the poor and sometimes people who are poor can't afford legal and other assistance. And they talk about donating professional time and donating your services. So they clearly see that lawyers should do that. And they talk about, they say they want it to be voluntary compliance and not mandatory, although there are some places who have different states that have reporting obligations. You can report privately what you've done to the bars. They can't discipline it, but people report. So it keeps people accountable, which I actually like, because otherwise you get busy. If you're reportable to the bar, people then do, more hours, or they donate money. And that's a good thing, because the ABA sees the obligation of legal services to the poor to also include, if you don't have time, writing a check. What's wrong with that? To something like the food bank, or an organization that you want to donate to that you feel is a good one. And so we see that. So they're addressing it right off. We also see in 6.1, 6.2, 6.3, talking about taking on pro bono clients and that kind of thing. And so right from the start, voluntary pro bono, they want 50 hours. So they say that you should do it. They don't make it disciplinary, but they say to charitable, religious, civic organizations. And that would, of course, include the food bank. Then you turn to California, right? And, I remember I assisted in the drafting of these rules. And so when we wanted, I knew I couldn't win an argument on mandatory pro bono. I knew I couldn't win that argument, but we wanted to put a provision in. And in the California, we see ethical rules very much like speeding ticket rules. In other words, you go over 55 and you get a ticket, because it makes it easy for the bar to discipline, right? If they're too detailed or they have hortatory language in them, it sometimes makes it hard to know what's the law and what's not the law. So we don't have the 6.1, we don't have that actual rule, but what we do have is we have in our 1.0, and it's comment 5, and it says very similar language to what the ABA says. And it says, that lawyers have a responsibility to help the poor. And they say again that they want you to do pro bono. So they're kind of copying a little bit the language. We don't have the taking on appointments from the court. We don't have certain rules that the ABA has, but we have that language. And also, if you see 6068 of the Business and Professions Code, that's the legislature. And they also can pass laws that regulate lawyers' conduct. And they say that you're never to turn down the cause of the defenseless or the oppressed. And it's very, that's vague language. To me, that's very broad language. And you don't see, disciplinary cases, but it's telling people that the legislator representing the people of the state of California thought that lawyers needed guidance to say, you need to help the defenseless and the oppressed, which would be the people that the food bank serves. So they definitely, I think the legislators wanted to put that in. And when we rewrote the rules of professional conduct, we didn't ask the legislature in some way to change that. We knew we were working with that language and we wanted to keep that language. So I found that very interesting. And then this morning, I was thinking, well, why do lawyers donate, and why particularly lawyers, and why should they? And I kind of asked my colleagues, and I mean, as someone, a part of the Christian tradition and somebody who has donated a lot of my service, my time and, money, I understand it. But what about somebody else who might not, or a young lawyer who's new, who has some debt and who's struggling? And so, the first thing that comes to my mind is, we have a monopoly on being lawyers, right? Because you have to take the bar, you got to have a degree. There's a lot of things. And we make more money than most, even if you work in doing low, like at legal aid, you're still making more than a lot of people make. And so, that right there to me is something. But also, I think that lawyers are public citizens with a responsibility to safeguard society, the administration of justice and democracy. And you can't really do that if people are going hungry, right? Because just like Cassidy said, she really hit it. She knows what she's talking about. People have got inflation, rent, gas, and food. And so if they're hungry, they can't be their best selves. It means they're not going to live up to their full potential and maybe become lawyers. I have to tell you, a lot of my law students now come from poverty backgrounds. Some of them have been incarcerated because they grew up poor, without fathers there, without mothers there, mothers who were drug addicts. I see that so much. I never used to see that. And they have food insecurity. And sometimes they're homeless, living in their cars. We never saw that when we were in law school. At least I never did. Maybe the younger people have or have experienced it. And so also, if people are poor and hungry, they tend to follow maybe the views of an extremist who they think might save them, that kind of thing. It leaves society and the administration of justice vulnerable. And it, of course, you see an increase in crime and violence. And I asked Deborah Coleman, it was interesting. She is a lawyer and she's on the April side. That's the Association for Professional Responsibility Lawyers. And I said, well, aside from legal services, this is the food bank, folks. I kind of promoted this, right? Throwing out that we have a food bank and, they could use some money. And she wrote back, and I thought it was interesting. She said, we know well that people who cannot afford basics for themselves and their families have reason to question the legitimacy of our system of laws and government, and to resent those who work in the system and who appear always to be better off. No matter what you may believe personally about the benefits of major structural change in this country, revolution is not friendly to lawyers. In the words that the bard put in the mouth of the revolutionaries in Henry VI, the first thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers. So that's what I have to say today. And I thought it was, she's right. People see us as, as the aristocracy, as de Tocqueville said many years ago in France. We are the American aristocracy, and therefore we have to help people because we're in a position to. And a lot of times, if they're at the food bank in line, they're having a hard time helping themselves. So that's what I would say to everybody today.
Well, thank you so much. And, it's actually a perfect transition to what we're going to discuss next, which is how food insecurity actually does affect the practice of law in some unusual ways.
Okay.
And here to help out with that is Justice Maria Rivera, who you all know from her time on the Superior Court bench or the First District Court of Appeal, or maybe she helped you out in mediation at her current gig with ADR Services. But what you might not know about Justice Rivera is the dedication that she had to community service before she ever took the bench, whether it was with the Bar Association itself or being a founding member of the women's section, or the time that she served on Contra Costa Legal Services. Justice Rivera really has dedicated her professional life to community service and access to justice. So because of her widespread practice, both in the trial court and appeal, I thought that she would be perfect to help talk about something that really surprised me when I was looking into how food insecurity affects our practice. And that's criminal law. If you Google it, you will see a number of studies that show a correlation between food insecurity and criminal acts. And I took a look, found a couple of cases in the Court of Appeal. They're both unpublished cases, but we're just going to use them as hypotheticals. And the first one is a sort of plain vanilla one. Man goes into a grocery store and actually steals food. And he's a family man, providing for his family. And when he was asked by the police whether he had a receipt for the food, he said, "No, I'm hungry." So what Justice Rivera I know there's something called a necessity defense in criminal law. Does hunger constitute a necessity defense?
Well, the short answer to that question is no. The longer answer is as follows. So let me give a little background. I think most of the people participating here are probably civil practitioners and not criminal practitioners. So it's important for you to understand the scope of the necessity defense. So using the simplest form of explanation, which would be the jury instruction on necessity, it has the following elements. I'm not going to read them all, but I'm going to read the key ones, the most important ones. And that is the defendant acted in an emergency to prevent significant bodily harm or evil to themselves or someone else. The defendant had no adequate legal alternative. And the defendant actually believed, and a reasonable person would believe, that the act was necessary to prevent the threatened harm or evil. And as you might imagine, the law being what it is, the operative phrase there is "in an emergency." Mm. So you might say, well, gee, guy goes in, he steals a pound of ground beef and a pizza for his family. What the heck? I mean, what's going on? The problem is that that's not an emergency. And it's hunger does not constitute imminent harm unless you're literally starving to death, which I don't think anybody who's stolen a loaf of bread from the store literally is. And I found a really eloquent explanation. There was a case down in Southern California in the appellate division of the San Diego Superior Court. And the case involves some protesters who were protesting nuclear arms, and they had done so illegally. They had blocked traffic and they blocked entrance to this factory, and they were, just being civilly disobedient. And so they were prosecuted for trespass and so forth, misdemeanors. And they were appealing to the appellate section of the Superior Court because one of the judges had not permitted them to prevent a necessity defense, the necessity being their need to bring to the public consciousness the danger and threat of weapons, nuclear weapons, to the very survival of humanity. And they felt that this was the quintessential necessity defense. And again, the operative issue or query is, well, is this an imminent harm? Of course, it was not. And so their argument failed. And Judge McConnell, who's now Justice Judith McConnell, back then as the Superior Court judge, wrote very eloquently explaining why. She wrote, "To accept the defense of necessity under the facts at bench would mean that markets may be pillaged because there are hungry people. Hospitals may be plundered for drugs because there are those in pain. Homes may be broken into because there are, unfortunately, some without shelter. Department stores may be burglarized for guns because there is fear of crime, and banks may be robbed because of unemployment.
Mhm.
She goes on to say, the defense of necessity is not a cause or a potentiality. It must be articulable to an immediate, imminent fear and compulsion. Some might argue that the apprehension of a nuclear holocaust is more than a potentiality, it is survival. But it is equally arguable that hunger, pain, and shelter are to those in need similarly issues of survival. I did an additional search beyond where Dan looked, and frankly found absolutely nothing anywhere in the United States accepting hunger as a defense to a crime, to a theft crime. In Italy, however, in 2014, in Italy, now I need to find my notes. The highest court in the land ruled that it isn't a crime when someone in desperate need steals a small amount of food. And the very highest court in Italy reversed a conviction of a man who had stolen food to feed his family. So the answer is here, no. Other places,
Yeah.
maybe.
I think you've convinced me on that one. But what if we made it more difficult? So we've got same situation. A man goes into a grocery store and also has family members that he provides for. And this time he does so by passing bad checks, but the result's the same. He's stolen food. But he's a super unlucky guy, and this is his third strike.
Oh,
Can he, in mitigation, in sentencing, bring up the fact that he was hungry, and that's why he committed the crime?
Yeah. Again, let me just give a little context. When the third strike law was originally passed, it was treated as a mandatory event. In other words, if you had a petty theft with a prior and you had two other strikes, which were serious or violent felonies, that was the end of the story. 25 to life, you're done. No questions, no arguments. Finally, the Supreme Court in the Romero case decided that no, you cannot take a judge's discretion away to strike priors, because under all the other sentencing schemes, judges were able to strike the priors that affected the sentencing, the mandatory sentencing. So the court said, no, the three strikes law can't be exempt from that kind of judicial discretion. So here, this gentleman that Dan has described asked the judge to strike some of the priors and gave a host of reasons, only one of which was that he was hungry and he needed to feed his family. And bottom line is no cigar. And I think it's important to note in this case, because I found one other case that had a similar argument made. It was a habeas corpus petition that went all the way to the US Supreme Court. And what the court did was it said, we're going to consider that. That's a consideration that we're going to look at. And we're going to look at all these other things you raised, like I've been a model prisoner and I've joined a church and I'm converting people in prison. It was a pile of things that he was arguing. But what happened was the courts rejected those arguments and said that it was, the trial court, the trial court could have stricken the strike. It's almost impossible to overturn that kind of act of judicial discretion, but the trial court chose not to. And of course, the standard of review in the Court of Appeal is abuse of discretion. So if the trial court chose not to strike the strike, it's very, very, very difficult for an appellate court to overturn that. And the appellate court did not. And basically, the bottom line was, in these two cases, you had gentlemen who were not successful primarily because they had long histories of theft crimes. They were not youthful offenders. They were in their 40s. And so they've been in and out and in and out and in and out of prison. And both had substance abuse issues, which also affected their criminal activities. And both of them had threatened violence in the commission of the crime. Neither of them had actually done anything, but one guy said, I have a knife, and did this like he had a knife to stab. He didn't actually have a knife, but he threatened violence. And so in the totality of the circumstances, while the trial judge might have stricken a strike based on the hunger mitigation, chose not to, and that was upheld on appeal.
Judge, what's interesting to me is that in state bar court, where ethics and morals and values, I mean, that's what the state bar court is about. I'd have to picture a scenario, we'd have to create one, but they would definitely look to hunger as mitigation.
Well,
so it's interesting, the difference in the courts, like, you know.
Let me broaden the horizon here just a second. It is the cases that we found are hardcore cases, okay? So I did a little more digging, and what I found was most rational district attorneys, prosecutors, if it's a single event, it's a first offense, you're stealing food, the presumption is you're hungry, you're poor, you're stealing food, we're not going to arrest you. Or if you get arrested for shoplifting, you get diverted. You're not going to be prosecuted. You're going to go into a diversion program. You're going to go into an A&D program, which is adjournment and dismissal, meaning they hold off on pressing the charges. You stay clean for 6 months, they dismiss. That's the reality on the ground. What Dan and I were talking about were the actual cases on the books, but those actual cases on the books, they get onto the books because they're really hardcore cases. And, you know, they're wonderful stories. Where is it? Let's see, I found this little blurb, and it's talking about hunger in America, about a North Carolina woman who was arrested because they found a video, a security video, discovered she had stolen $36 worth of food. The woman was unemployed because of a brain injury. Nevertheless, she was arrested. They discovered, however, that she and her 3 children had not eaten in 3 days. And the officers who made the arrest looked into her refrigerator and later bought her $140 worth of food. The woman said she had reached out in vain to various organizations and nobody would help them. She was nevertheless arrested. Now, I doubt she was jailed. There's another story about a man in Bogalusa, of course, in the Deep South, who stole $5 worth of food, was arrested. His name was Rozzy Scott. He was arrested, wasn't put in jail, but he was charged with petty theft and he was fined $450. Now, this is a man who was stealing food because he couldn't buy it. And he was ordered to pay a fine of $450. There was no other option. And he couldn't pay it. And when he came back to court and said he couldn't pay it, the judge said, oh, well, if you pay the court $50 for an extension, you can stay out of jail. Well, that was completely illegal. And the Southern Center for Poverty and Law took the case and got that changed. I mean, it was basically debtor's prison, right? So these are the goings on the ground in the cases where hunger is the reasonably believed to be the only motivating factor.
Well, it sounds to me like, especially that last fact pattern, the woman with 3 children, et cetera, that would be the perfect situation for an impact case, which we're going to talk about just briefly right now. I think everybody here has probably heard of impact litigation, but maybe not, using that terminology. It's generally litigation that's brought about to bring about social change, societal change. Usually the object in the litigation is not money. It's an injunction or other equitable relief to change a law, create new law that will impact societal change. There are a number of organizations nationwide, as well as in California, that have that bring impact litigation on hunger and food insecurity issues. And there was one that was just recently announced last month, brought by the Western Center on Law and Poverty against Los Angeles, because Los Angeles was dragging its feet in providing processing emergency applications for CalFresh applications. And I'm going to put it in the chat just after I shut up, but I'm going to put a press release. And there was a great quote from one of the named plaintiffs in that case. And it said, "We wouldn't tolerate it if the fire department took a day to respond to a fire, and we shouldn't waste time when people are hungry. The county has the resources provided by the federal government to respond immediately." And the result of that settlement was a permanent injunction against LA, requiring them to process them immediately as they should. Impact litigation. There are, like I said, there are a number of organizations in the state and nationwide that do this. If you participate in such a case and you get a good result, you will remember that case for the rest of your life. You will get more satisfaction from that case than your multi-million-dollar verdict. If anybody is interested, email me and I can put you in touch with some of the groups that do this type of litigation. Justice Rivera is also going to help talk about something that you may or may not be aware of called CCCBA. CCCBA simply means the next best alternative. And it is something that can be employed in several types of litigation. Could be used in impact litigation. Typically in class actions, you settle a case or you try the case and you get a pot of money, and then it's your job to distribute it to claimants. Claimants may not cash the checks. They may have passed away. And there is often what's called a residual fund. And then it's up to class counsel to ask the court to direct the residual funds to be given to a charity. And the charity ought to have some nexus with the case. So if you wanted to make a charitable contribution to a food bank, then an appropriate case would be maybe a food mislabeling case or a food misbranding case. But if you're creative, I think you will find a trial court that is very willing to help you direct the money to the food bank. So, for example, I recently learned that food banks, both our food bank, the Contra Costa food bank, as well as the nationwide food bank, Feeding America, are what's known as second responders in disasters. So when there is a disaster in the state of California, our food bank and Feeding America are there the next day with food and water to help people that are desperate for that. I think they were there in the Chico fire. They were there, I believe, at Santa Rosa the next day. I think if you have a case that involves any disaster, mass disaster and there are residual funds, the court would be willing to find that a sufficient nexus to give the residual to the food bank, either the Contra Costa Food Bank or the nationwide food bank. And it can have a real impact. And I thought maybe Justice Rivera could give us some insight as to what a Cypre recipient donation can mean to a charitable organization.
So, as many of you know, I was, when I was practicing law in Contra Costa, one of the things I was really active in the Contra Costa Legal Aid. At that time, it was called Contra Costa Legal Aid Association, I think, on its board. And I eventually became its president of the board. And it's now, I think, a part of Bay Legal. Anyway, there is a legal aid in your county. And of course, legal aid is always struggling for money, especially under certain presidents who don't like to give money to legal aid, and they try to cut it constantly. And there's a constant battle. The ABA is always going and flooding the legislature with advocates for legal aid nationwide when they keep trying to cut the legal aid budget that comes out of the federal government. Of course, they put all kinds of restrictions on it. You know, you can't represent undocumented people, and you can't do any impact litigation, and you can't, I mean, it's ridiculous. But anyway, at any rate, so you're always struggling for money, and you're having little fundraisers and you're writing grants. Of course, the greatest source for legal aid in California is the wonderful Legal Services Trust Fund, which is, as you know, you put your trust fund money, your client's money, into a trust account. And if there is a significant amount of interest, it goes to your client. But if there is an insignificant amount of interest that's almost incalculable, they can pool all those together and it becomes a large sum of money, and that gets distributed to the legal aid offices across California. So that's the main source of funding, but you're always looking for more money. You're always understaffed. It just doesn't matter where you are, what you're doing, you're always understaffed and you always need more money. So one day I went to a bar lunch. I happened to sit next to an attorney named Barry Baskin. And Barry and I never met each other. We talked. I found out about his South African background and so on and so forth. And for some reason, we got on the subject of the Legal Services Organization. And I was, talking about how poor we are. We need money all the time. And he says, well, have you ever thought about Cypre? And I said, what's that? And he explained what a Cypre award is, as Dan has just explained it. And I said, well, yeah, like sign us up. And next thing I knew, he got some large award, and there was a residual, as it turned out, after all the payouts had been made. And he went to the court and he made the case for giving it to the Contra Costa Legal Services. I can't remember what the nexus was. I think it was a consumer law thing where poor people were being tricked. And so there was a nexus in terms of protecting poor people from that kind of activity. And next thing I knew, this big check came into our coffers. And I will tell you, I was the happiest camper in the world. And, all made possible by the firm of Baskin, Bramson, blah, can't remember all the names in that, right, Dan? Mr. Plutzik's here, I think. Mr. Bramson's here. Yes. So I just can't begin to tell you how important those Cypre awards can be to any community organization that is always struggling for money.
Thanks for bringing that home. And I have spoken to Cypre recipients, and it's just something that falls out of the sky when you are busy writing a grant for, $5,000 and you receive something for $50,000 or even in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, and it really can change your help your mission. I forgot to mention that cypre can also be used in probate matters. When there is a charitable beneficiary that was maybe in existence 50 years ago that's no longer in existence, one can petition the court for permission to make a cypre award to another charitable organization that is the next best use of that money. And the other way that that can fit into a trust practice, you know, they're often, I'm told by people that do this work all the time, not myself, but sometimes people come to a trust lawyer wanting to make a charitable contribution, but not really knowing who they should make one to. And just a pitch for Feeding America, as well as the food bank. I mean, I think Feeding America, the last time I looked, 99 cents out of every dollar you give to Feeding America goes to feeding hungry people. That's amazing. Look at charitable organizations out there. That's something you should tell the court too, because the court will be impressed.
Is Cassidy still with us? Can she tell us the percentage of the budget that goes to actually feeding people?
I don't.
Hi.
Yeah, she is. Yay.
Hi. Oh, my camera's off. Hello. Tavy, do you know how much of our budget? I have it on a PowerPoint saved in my email. I can bring it up.
Same
can
here.
find
Yeah, if you want to just look, I want to say it is 97 cents that goes directly. I can also double check that as well, but that is, if we're not as high as Feeding America, obviously, but very, very close. And I'm gonna double check that just because it's been a while since I've seen those numbers.
Thank you.
I'm sorry for throwing that out there. I didn't even intend to say it. I just remembered looking at that with Feeding America, and that is so impressive. If you look at the general and administrative expenses of most charities that you contribute to, you will find them 70%, 80%, and that's good. You know, this is amazing. So I just want to thank everybody so much for coming today. And I just sort of wanted to summarize by bringing home some of the points that we wanted to communicate. And so how can you help the food bank? It does affect your practice. You know, consider an impact case. I'm going to put my contact information in the chat. If you're interested, I will put you together with groups that do that work. Consider a cypre award if you can. Volunteer at the food bank. I'll tell you, that is just so rewarding. And I just learned that because of COVID, et cetera, volunteer participation is down 30%, 25 to 30% right now. So the food bank really needs bodies. Go to the warehouse and help them pack a crate. That would, you know, that would really help out a lot. And one thought, I actually did this one time. I think Justice Rivera might even remember the case. A case, two people hated each other. They would never settle the case. It was so complicated, no judge was ever going to understand it. We settled the case by having each one of them make a $10,000 donation to a charity. So think about it, you know, think outside the box. And the last way, of course, that you can help out the food bank is to participate in our virtual drive. Tell other people about it, use the links that are in the chat. And we also have an emeritus group. And those are people that used to be Bar Association members. Maybe they've retired from practice. Maybe they've gone somewhere else. There's a team, a emeritus team that's on the very first link. It's all set up. If you know somebody that fits in that category, copy the URL, send it to them and ask them if they'd like to participate. So thank you, everyone. We really appreciate, let me just put my name in here in case anybody really wants it. You're never going to be able to spell it after you leave this call. So if you are interested.
Dan, we can also send an email out to everybody who is here with all of the information that we've been putting in here too, in the chat.
Okay, great.
really important to, like, if you can just email the link to the video. If you can get somebody to watch the video for 1 minute, they will know why they need to support this year's food drive. So just try it. I've been trying it with people and they kind of go, oh, yeah.
Yeah, a lot of this I didn't know until right now coming to this presentation. So I'm learning a lot just being here about the food bank. I didn't realize the need was so great. I didn't realize.
Yeah, I think inflation, if you are on the edge of poverty and something like inflation comes along and you need gas to get to your job, which you need your job desperately, just a little thing. I mean, I see it in my practice all the time. Just a little nudge can really set you up.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, thank you to everybody. Before we go, Barbara, the video Barbara is mentioning is the video that was done by the food bank's current president and CEO, Joel Systrom, and it's somewhere in the chat.
It is.
And it's a 30-second video, and I think it really does help.
And someone explain how, once we leave the meeting, how do we find these links? Because the chat's closed.
I'll send them to you.
I'll send out an email to everybody who is here and who registered, and it'll have all the different links and Dan's contact information as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Justice Rivera, Carol, and Cassidy, really
Dan,
appreciate your time.
Do you want to mention the raffle? How that's
Yeah.
Oh, I forgot.
A raffle.
The most important thing. Somehow mysteriously, a double blind selection process is going to happen.